What up, What is up, everybody? Welcome to Shoot the Gap, our IDP fantasy football podcast here at fantasyandframes.com and on the Fantasy and Frames podcast network. I'm your host for this off-season / dynasty season, Jorge Edwards. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about some of the top defensive linemen from 2023. We're going to talk about the things that made them so impressive, whether we think they're one-hit wonders, whether or not they have longevity in the fantasy space going forward, all that stuff. So get ready as we talk some IDP fantasy football next. So before we get started with today's episode, I want to introduce to everybody in the IDP community to Chris Burns, aka Dynasty Deviant on X. Make sure you give him a follow. He is joining Nate Markham and myself here in producing some IDP content here at Fantasy and Frames, and he's going to be with us on Shoot the Gap going forward. You can also see a lot of his work when it comes to the Dynasty content we put out here at Fantasy and Frames, and more so on Dynasty 365, our Dynasty podcast, which will return from a short hiatus right after the Super Bowl. So without further introduction, Chris, how are you doing tonight, man?
Jorge, I am doing well. I'm excited to be a part of, Shoot the Gap, get into the IDP side of fantasy. Feel great. Happy to be here and, feeling good as always.
Nice. Very nice. So obviously we just are wrapping up championship weekend. You and I were talking off the air about just things we noticed and things we enjoyed. Which fan base do you feel worse for? Let's put it like this: the Ravens fan base or the Lions fan base?
I feel the worst for the Lions fan base just because they've been waiting for so long, and watching that game, they saw it just slip out of their hands, making it to that Super Bowl. So I feel bad for them. Like the Ravens, they've had success much more recently. And, it hasn't been as long for them. But, yeah, for Detroit and, those long-suffering fans, I felt for them. My heart broke for them. So I think they felt it the most.
Yeah, when I'm scrolling through, my X timeline or my Twitter timeline, and for those who don't realize that Twitter is now called X, it's not code for anything more scandalous than that, I promise. Sometimes, I guess, those advertisements will get you. Anywho, I'm scrolling through there, and every Detroit Lions fan that I see on there, it's like, we're playing with house money. We got nothing to lose. Let's just go out there and have a good time. And they were happy for a good part of the game. And then things went downhill. On the flip side, Ravens fans, you cocky sons of, you know what? It's like, well, we'll see you. We'll see you in Las Vegas. We already have, I don't know if you do this for your Super Bowl parties, but I always like to get for a Super Bowl party, the official plates and, spoons and cups and whatever of the Super Bowl that year. And so it's all purple and red. And I'm sure you heard the conspiracy theories that it was supposed to be the Ravens and some team that had a red logo, aka the 49ers. And so, yeah, they're all like, yeah, we're going to have our custom Super Bowl decor ready to go. Yada, yada, yada. Oh, no, not happening. Sorry. Just an utter ass whooping by Kansas City. Kudos to the Chiefs for making it. But I don't know. Defensively speaking, IDP wise, this should be a very fun game. And we'll be definitely talking about that heading into the Super Bowl next week, just for fun. But speaking of IDP, why don't we get into what we're here to talk about, which is some of the top performers at the defensive line position here at in fantasy football in 2023. We're going to be breaking it down between the interior linemen, aka the defensive tackles, and then your edge rushers, which can constitute your defensive ends or outside linebackers, whether you're playing in a 3-4 or 4-3 based defense. As always, here we use Fantasy Pros IDP scoring because we take part in the Fantasy Pros ECR competition. And not to mention, those stats are readily available to you over at fantasypros.com. And we'll be using the stats that matter when it comes to fantasy point scoring, using the information from the good people over from fantasydata.com, which if you use the promo code Fantasy and Frames when you sign up, you will get 20% off of your monthly subscription. So head over to fantasydata.com today and use the promo code Fantasy and Frames. So let's get into it, Chris. Let's talk about these top 20 defensive linemen, both at the interior and edge positions. I'm going to throw up a graphic on screen. So looking here, from left to right, with Shoot the Gap podcast right in the middle, for those who are unaware of what they're watching, we have, on our left, our top edge rushers, designated by the kind folks over at PFF and their fantasy point per game average in 2023. On the right, we have defensive tackles. And so let's address the elephant in the room here. We were talking about purely defensive linemen, positioning and rostership of players you want on your team. Having these true edge rushers are really what you want in terms of fantasy production. The very last, in the top 20 in points per game last year, Jermaine Johnson had an average of 8.8 points per game. You look over to the defensive tackles, it goes south of 8.8 very quickly. So you really want to, if you're trying to use a defensive tackle in your defensive lineman only spot, you want to make sure you're getting one of the more productive ones. But how do we measure production? How do we, get into that? We'll tell you in this episode. So I'm just going to tell you right now, folks, we peek behind the curtain. I was looking at the notes that both Chris and I put together. Get ready to have your mind blown in terms of production quality, in terms of just how these advanced metrics that we'll be talking about played into the significance of how good these top edge rushers were, which Chris will get into in a little bit. But I'm going to tackle defensive tackles because there's a lot less to sort through and sift through when we get into that. So let's look at the top, 5 or 6 here. You have DeForest Buckner using, again, Fantasy Pros IDP scoring, averaging 10.4 points per game, followed by Zach Seiler of the Miami Dolphins with 9.7, Derek Brown of the Carolina Panthers, 9.2, Justin Madubuike, who just was a phenomenal waiver wire pickup. You did not draft him. For those who say, well, I drafted, no, you did not. Stop it. You picked him up on waivers, and if you did, like this guy, you probably won a championship like this guy. Wink, wink, humble, nudge, nudge. Ed Oliver, Jeffrey Simmons, Christian Barrymore, Christian Wilkins, Aaron Donald to round out some of these players that are playing at the quote-unquote, upper elite levels in Fantasy Pro scoring at the defensive tackle position. And so I wanted to do a deep dive and look at certain metrics that you can find at various places. I like using PFF for theirs. And there are certain things that I take into account when I'm analyzing defensive tackles for fantasy purposes. Now, obviously, for fantasy purposes, again, if I'm playing in leagues that just have a defensive lineman designation only, I'm paying less attention to that versus leagues where there's a defensive tackle specific position like you can find on ESPN, like you could find over at MFL. I'm paying a little bit more close attention to that. But you look at players like DeForest Buckner, some of the things we like to talk about here at Fantasy and Frames is, IDP comes down to a lot of things. It comes down to opportunity and what you do with the opportunity in terms of efficiency. And so when we talk about that, we talk about certain things like win rate, how quickly a defensive lineman is able to beat their blocker. We talk about pressure rate, how much pressure in terms of sacks and hits and hurries on a quarterback, making them feel uncomfortable in the pocket, how good and effective they are at doing that. We talk about tackle rates, how good they actually are at making a tackle. There are a lot of players out there that are really bad at making tackles, like literally like whiffing air. And you just have to ask yourself, why? How does this happen? It does. And that really matters when you start thinking about, players and their longevity and their consistency for fantasy purposes in IDP. So, when I'm looking here, again, DeForest Buckner, Zyler Brown, we're ranging from 10.4 points a game to 8.9. And some of the things that really stood out from these players, is that a majority of them had, above a league average in win rate. So a lot of these players are beating their interior offensive lineman blocks, which is great because you want them getting into the backfield, either getting a sack or getting a quarterback hit or getting a tackle for a loss, which translates all into fantasy points, which is what we're here to talk about, right? The next thing we get into is pressure rates. We want the pressure, specifically dealing with the sacks and the quarterback hits, not so much the tackles for a loss, so to speak. We talk about the snaps. We talk about the tackle rates. Let me get into missed tackle rates here. And I want you all to pay attention here to number 10, Quinnen Williams going on down. You look at Quinnen Williams, Deron Payne, Harrison Phillips, Chris Jones, Kansas City Chief. Everybody knows Chris Jones. He will be probably one of the highly sought after free agents on the defensive side of the ball, assuming that the Chiefs don't re-up him, which I don't think they will. But again, we'll talk about that more when we get into free agency a little bit later in the spring. But you're looking at all these players just precipitously just dropping down in fantasy point production, and you have to ask yourself why. Well, I'm looking at their pressure rates. I'm looking at their win rates, all, in the double digits, mid to upper double digits in terms of teens, which is great. You want we're looking at the defensive snaps. Again, their snap totals were fairly high. We look at the defensive stops, which basically is a PFF stat that talks about how effective they were in stopping a play on the field. Or stopping the offense from having a successful play on the field, which means like translating into a first down, translating into a scoring opportunity, so on and so forth. All these players, are doing well, but yet their fantasy production has just been really not as elite as you would think. And the only thing I could attribute it to is tackle rate and how efficient they are at making tackles. Or in this case, with these players, again, talking about the Williams and Deron Paynes and Chris Jones, their missed tackle rates were crazy. Chris Jones had a missed tackle rate of 26.9%. Okay. For me, when I'm looking at defensive tackles or defensive players in general, whether they're defensive linemen, linebackers, defensive backs, I want my missed tackle rate to be like as close to single digits as possible. If you're in like the 10 to 13, like 10 to 13% range, I can live with that if the volume in tackles is there, if the volume in snaps is there, then I'm okay with it. That is not the case for these players. Now, again, a lot of things will go into whether I see somebody like a Deron Payne or a Jonathan Allen, who's at the bottom of the list here. A lot of things will play into whether these people are going to be good for you for fantasy next year. We look at what happened here in Washington. They traded away two of their outside rushers. These guys, they left via trade, and that kind of exposed a lot of the performance, for lack of a better term, that the Washington front line had in getting pressures on the quarterback and making these plays and making these players fantasy viable. So that's kind of no surprise there. The question is, what do they do? If the Commanders go out there and get a Brian Burns or a Josh Allen, does that automatically restore fantasy relevance to Jonathan Allen and Deron Payne? Possibly. Takes a little bit of the pressure off them so they can just focus on their assignments versus being double teamed, which is probably what has led to their not so great performance here from fantasy perspective. But again, the missed tackle rate really jumps out at players like David Onyemata. We talk about Leonard Williams, who had really good plays this year and played very well. But for fantasy purposes, again, it's the tackles. It's missing out on the tackle opportunities. It's missing out on getting those easy fantasy points that a lot of these interior defensive tackles, despite their name value, it just did not translate into fantasy. And the flip side, you have certain players that kind of outperformed, which you would think they would normally perform. Let's look at Ed Oliver, defensive tackle for the Buffalo Bills. Number 5 in fantasy points per game with 9 points per game using Fantasy Pro scoring. Had a win rate of 12%, a pressure rate of 13%, a tackle rate of 10.4%. I stop right there and I'm like, Ed Oliver, why am I not rostering him on all my teams going forward? Well, then I look at his missed tackle rate, 21.6%. Like, I want you to make more tackles than you miss. I know that sounds super counterintuitive, but like these are things that we look at that kind of help spotlight the anomalies in performance, whether it's for the better or for the worse. Somebody who is a really good edge rusher or a defensive tackle or IDP player in general who has, checked off all the boxes in terms of like advanced metrics, right? And play on the field, it doesn't produce for fantasy. Like what is the missing piece here? Again, that's something we'll be talking about definitely as we get into edge rushers a little bit later. But in this case, Ed Oliver, it's the missed tackle rate. So would I expect Ed Oliver to have a repeat of his performance this coming year? Not so much. We then talk about Justin Matabuki from Baltimore, free agent. I hope the Ravens re-sign him. They'd be stupid not to. He again 9.1 points per game for a defensive tackle, number 4 defensive tackle score and Fantasy Pro scoring, 14% win rate, a 12.5 pressure rate, a 12.2% tackle rate, 10.5 missed tackle rate. Again, like I told you, 10 to 13 I can live with if the snaps are there, and the performance was there, and the total tackles were there. Basically the volume. Give me all the volume. He was on the field for a lot of the plays, most passing play situations. So I'm okay with that. I'm happy with that. Somebody that I could see if he comes back to Baltimore being, again, somebody that I would probably want to pay up for in defensive tackle leagues. If these leagues are like IDP only, we can get into the draft strategy of, offensive leagues with IDPs in them in a later time. But again, somebody who, for a defensive line only league, I would consider him as a starter in a defensive line only, considering the fact that he is somebody who is a quote unquote defensive tackle who may not get as much opportunity one-on-one to get to the quarterback as one of these elite pass rushers like a Parsons or a Watt. It's just the efficiency, again, the low missed tackle rate, and the opportunity all aligned together, which is why somebody I'm very high on. We talk about another person, Ed, Jeffrey Simmons, Tennessee Titan, again, number 6, 8.9 points per game, double digits in win rate and pressure rate. The tackle numbers weren't as high, but the missed tackle rates were lower. So again, somebody who I'm like, okay, again, trusted, reliable over the years, people who've been playing in IDP defensive tackle leagues, you've been happy rostering Jeffrey Simmons. He didn't give you a reason in 2023 to think that you shouldn't do so going forward otherwise. Now, Chris, I see the banners behind you. I see the helmet. Okay, first of all, is that a full-size Dolphins helmet I see right back there? Yep, microphone's on mute, but I'm going to assume that was a yes.
Yes, it is a full-size helmet.
Who wears a full-size helmet also is Zach Seiler. He finished as the number 2 defensive tackle in Fantasy Pro scoring with a 9.7 per game average. He had 857 snaps. He had 65 total tackles for PFF. He had his metrics were okay. Advanced metrics, his pressure rate, his win rate was okay. But again, a 16.1% missed tackle rate. Again, inefficiency, and one of the most important departments. Not somebody I would be predictive of staying going forward. Again, DeForest Buckner, number 1, 10.4 points per game. The Role on YouTube. I will get to your question in 1 minute. Just hang tight. Elite, 15.3% win rate, 10% pressure rate, missed tackle rate, 7.8%. Just what you want. You want the consistency. You don't want the people who are layering in one deficient area of their performance. So just, interesting takeaways here from these top defensive tackles. Again, going back to the graphic that we have right here, am I ever going to say, well, you're going to want to start Jonathan Allen over Max Crosby in a defensive line only league? No. But again, we can get into the whole aspect of defensive tackle only positions and rostership in a future episode. But as a whole, we're looking at the top performers again from 2023. And I would say out of all these players, a Buckner, Derek Brown, Matabike, Jeffrey Simmons, Christian Barmore. That is going to be a name you're going to be hearing maybe in an IDP Dynasty Target article or video sooner rather than later. So just pay attention to that name going forward this year. Then we talk about Christian Wilkins and talking about, I talked about Seiler, we talked about Christian Wilkins. A lot of things have changed on the defensive side of the ball here. Chris, you being the resident Dolphins fan, Vic Fangio, no longer there. He's in Philadelphia. What exactly is going to happen when the new defensive coordinator comes in here, and how's that going to affect the value of these players going forward? Potential buy low candidates in your dynasty leagues. And speaking of dynasty leagues, let's get into the question here we have on YouTube from The Roll. He said, just made a trade for Sauce Gardner It's an 8-man. I gave 2/5 and Devin Witherspoon for Sauce and a 5th, the last draft pick. So without knowing much about, the roster designations that you have here, I'm going to give you some thoughts here and crucify me if you'd like. If this was I don't like the trade. We talk about IDP, we talk about efficiency, we talk about opportunity is what leads to production. So just because somebody, for IDP purposes, just because somebody is good as a real NFL defensive player does not necessarily mean that translates to being a really good person you want rostering an IDP spot from week to week. Sauce Gardner, known as one of the most prolific, shutdown corners the past 2 seasons for the New York Jets. Now, you think about this from an intuitive standpoint. If I'm the opposing quarterback and Sauce Gardner is shutting down every wide receiver that he defends, am I throwing to Sauce Gardner's direction, or am I going to the guy who's going to give me more opportunity? Chris, I mean,
I'm throwing to the guy who's going to give me more opportunity.
Boom. Yeah. So therefore, your opportunities for tackles, for pass deflections, for pass breakups, or whatever you want to call them, that goes out the window. That goes out the window because, again, the ball's not going to be going that person's way. It's going to be going to the other guy. On the flip side, in cornerback specific leagues, I did a little deep dive into this a few weeks ago. Put it on my tweeted this out or X this out. What's the verb here? That we talk about. We used to say tweeted, but now with it being called X, it's like, is it X'd out? Is it? But that means crossed out.
I still stick with tweets. They're still called tweets, though. They're not retweets, but they're still tweets.
Okay, fine, fair enough. We'll keep calling them tweets, as long as Elon keeps, doing that. Looking at cornerback specifically, Devin Witherspoon was actually one of the most prolific cornerbacks for fantasy purposes this past season, because he not only had a lot of pass deflections, he also played. He had a lot of tackle opportunities. He made himself more play closer to, or the defensive scheme, I should say, helped him play closer to the line of scrimmage, had more tackle opportunities there. Just an all-around, just really good player who teams were not shying away from as much as they would be shying away from Sauce Gardner. So if your teammate here, or your league mate is like, I don't know. Can you do a redo? I don't know. That's my thought there. You can obviously have your different opinions, and it kind of depends on your league size and scoring settings and whatnot. But that's my initial takeaway from the trade right there. Have another comment here. What do we think of Tuilapu for Dynasty going forward? I like him. I think he's one of the unheralded edge rushers that I'm definitely trying to acquire in Dynasty. What's going on with Joey Bosa? We don't know. What's going on with Khalil Mack's long-term time as a Los Angeles Charger? I don't know. There's a lot of money that's being paid to a lot of these players in Los Angeles for the Chargers that can't keep being paid to these players much longer. And so I think with the draft capital they invested into Tuilapu, wow, that's a tongue twister. I think you hold steady. You keep them on your roster, because I personally, barring some crafty bookkeeping, which is possible. It's obviously possible. Teams have found ways to do it for years. I do not see Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa both being on the team this year. In fact, if I'm a Joey Bosa manager in my dynasty leagues, I'm trying to get rid of my shares and trying to get shares here of Tuli here for the Los Angeles Chargers for dynasty. So those are my thoughts on that there. So that's kind of what it comes down to. Defensive tackles. You really want to go after the really productive ones, the really efficient ones, to have any. Those are the ones you would be comfortable putting into a defensive line only spot there. But Chris, as you're about to get into, really it comes down to the edge rushers, the outside linebackers, the defensive ends in a 3-4 or 4-3. This is where the bread and butter is made. This is where the designation or the true position designation comes in handy here. Gary Davenport, the godfather of IDP at IDP Sharks on X, had been petitioning for years to get outside linebackers clumped into the defensive line category because this whole concept of true position being that, look, if your job is to get to the quarterback, you should all, every player whose job is to get to the quarterback should be classified under one category, aka defensive lineman. So because of that, you get a lot more upside with a lot of these defensive linemen than you did in previous years. But enough about that. Chris, why don't you take it away here? Let's talk about some edge rushers. And who would you like to talk about first?
All right, Jorge, if you put that graphic back up. So the first group that I want to talk about is going to be the top 5 edge rushers in Fantasy Pros scoring for points per game. And as you look at the graphic, you look at the edge rushers on the left, you'll see, like, I'm going to break it down pretty much into what I see to be defined tier breaks in the scoring this year. And that first tier is going to be, the first 5. It just happens to work out like that. The second tier is going to be, 6 through 10, and then the final 10. So the first group that I'm going to talk about is the top 5 edge rushers in scoring. And those were TJ Watt from Pittsburgh with his 14.8 points per game, from Fantasy Pros IDP scoring. Khalil Mack from the Chargers, almost said the Los Angeles Clippers, but from the Chargers with 14.3 points per game. Danielle Hunter of Minnesota with 13. Jalen Phillips from Miami with 12.7. And Max Crosby from Las Vegas with 12.4. So these were your top 5 scorers in points per game, for our Fantasy Pros IDP scoring. So I'm going to take this first group and just going to break it down a little bit of how they fared and, try to come to a consensus of what led them to get to, that top 5 scoring. And so the first metric that we're going to start off, we're going to talk about total snaps. And if you look at the total snaps of the top 20 the edge rushers for 2023, we see like trends, so 4 of the top 5 in the Fantasy Pro scoring, like they had like 900 total snaps. And Crosby had 1,082. Hunter had 1,004. Mack had 934. And TJ Watt had 930. So those guys, they finished in the top 5 in points per game. And they also had those 900 snaps. So that's something that made me start looking at that like, oh, okay. So these total snaps might mean a little something to me, because initially I'm thinking that it's all going to be about tackles. It's all going to be about, like rushing and things like that, but not necessarily so from what I'm seeing. The outlier from those top 5 was Jalen Phillips. He had an injury like on Thanksgiving, like right after Thanksgiving. And so then he was out after that. But he was still, 12.7 points per game for those games that he did play. And even though he is an outlier, I look at the position that was filled by him, like Andrew Van Ginkel came in for him after that injury, and he was in the top 20 as also. So I had to believe if Phillips did not get injured, that he still would be on this list. But another major outlier that we see in total snaps is Aiden Hutchinson, who had 986 snaps, which is 3rd amongst edge rushers. He finished 3rd amongst edge rushers, but he only finished 12th in points per game. A little bit later, we'll try to dig into like what may have led to that. So no other edge rusher like had over 880 total snaps. So just from looking at that right there and like how it's so top heavy, points per game, like total snaps, it seems to have a solid correlation in fantasy points per game, which that's what you're looking for. You're trying to figure out these guys that are going to give you that high floor and give you consistent fantasy points a game. So if you start off not knowing where to go, if you look at total snaps and you find those guys who are getting over 900 total snaps, then you have a pretty good indication of where you're going to start getting points from. But let's keep on going a little bit farther. So pass rush snaps, 4 of the top 5 points per game scores, they met the metric. They were in that top 6, and they had over 530 snaps. Crosby, 650. Hunter, 613. Watt, 551. And Mack, 534. So they're all over that 530 metric. And that also put them like top 4, 4 of the top 5, so they're 4 in top 6, which is pretty good. Aiden Hutchinson, who finished 2nd in pass rush snaps, Nick Bosa, who finished 4th in pass rush snaps, they did, finish 10th like at 9.9 in points per game, respectively, but they weren't in that top echelon of edge rushers. So when we look at stuff like that, it's not as strong as total snaps, but it's still a pretty good correlation to the points. We're seeing that, okay, so if these guys are on the field a lot, and if these guys are rushing the passer a lot, these guys have a tendency to score points a lot. So that is pretty, indicative. So that's like opportunity is going to lead to production. Just like with anything in fantasy, as Jorge said a little bit earlier, you want more opportunity. The more opportunity you get, the better chance you have of production. More shots on goal, your better chance of scoring. Let's go a little bit farther. We're looking at total pressures. And this right here is where we start to see, like, there's a slide down from those top 5, that top tier sliding down, into the list or whatever. So the top 5 scores, they managed to get 80 to 94 in total snaps. But we look at Parsons, Hutchinson, and Nick Bosa. They were top 3s in pressures, but they were out of the top 5 in scoring. As you can see, like, you look where Max Crosby is the end of that first tier break. Crosby, who had 94 total pressures, Khalil Mack, 88, Watt, 86, and Hunter, 80. So all these guys, are in that range, that 80 to 94 sweet spot of where you're looking for when you're trying to find, a true, score when it comes to edge rushing. The top of the list here, like our pass rush specialists. So the guys who are in that top 5 are going to be, like the Micah Parsons, the Aiden Hutchinsons, and the Nick Bosas, the guys that really get out there on the field, and their goal is to just flat out get after the quarterback. So they were the ones who finished top in the pressures. But even though they finished top in the pressures, they still didn't make it up to that list of, fantasy points per game scoring. If we go down to total tackles, for these top 5, it seems to be like the sweet spot for that is 62 plus, for total tackles. Crosby and Daniil Hunter, like, they are the only 2 that made the top 5, in points per game to be top 5 in tackles. Khalil Mack, he finished 8th. Watts, he finished 12th. So it's different now. We're starting to see where we're starting to come back to the pack here. Like total tackles, like you have a splattering of the top 20 scores, like they're mix and match. They're all through that list somewhere, so you really can't see a strong pattern. Nothing is close to what you've seen to total snaps and pass rush snaps. And then we get down to defensive stops. Now, when we look at defensive stops, we're back into where we're seeing a cluster of those top 5 finishing at the top of this category. As Jorge told you earlier, like defensive stops, it's a metric that PFF has come up with where it's when you stop the offense from having what they would consider a positive play. So like Jorge, you're stopping him from getting a first down, you're stopping him from getting a touchdown, or, you're putting him in like an adverse situation. Those are the considered stops. So 3 of the top 4 in points per game finish top 3 in stops, and they range anywhere from 49 to 52 of those stops. And those guys were Mack, he finished 2nd, Hunter, he finished 3rd, Watt, he finished 1st respectively, and as you see, they are in the top 5 of points per game. Crosby, he had 5 and he finished 8th, and he had 38 stops. So if you look at this right here, just by, of the top 5 scores and so many being in that top cluster for points per game, it is an extremely strong correlation, to consistent points per game scoring. So initially I was thinking that win rate, pressure rate, total tackles, or something like that would actually give you more of a correlation to which edge rushers are going to be getting these scoring opportunities. And it's not necessarily the case. Like the win rate, the pressure rate, the total tackles, that is more of a secondary, like, stat that you're looking for when you're looking for your points per games. So if you are on the field, like getting all those total snaps and you're getting pass rushing snaps, and then you're also good at your win rate and your pressure rate, then you're going to score some points. But it just seems that the true pass rushers, the Myles Garrett, the Michael Parsons, the Nick Bosas, they aren't on the field as much as some of these other guys like Watt and Crosby. And it shows with their points per game, which I thought was very, very it just blew my mind to see this because it just wasn't what I was expecting, Like Jalen Phillips, he had 7.1, Crosby at 5.2, with their tackle rate, and they finished in the top 6. So those guys, they actually, like Phillips, he's going to go out and play that linebacker role a little bit more where he's actually still making some tackles and setting the edge and trying to collapse down. So when we look at that, okay, that kind of makes sense also. But still, overall, we just want those guys who are actually on the field more and that are pass rushing and also getting those stops. It's awesome to see. So total snaps, stops, pass rush, like these are the metrics that are absolutely setting the top 5 apart from the rest of the top 20, which if you're like doing your draft, those are the guys that you're going to look for. You want to look for those numbers and everything. All right, so Jorge, if you could put that the graphic back up.
Yeah.
The next grouping that we're going to talk about, where I say like the next tier, is going to be your edge rushers between number 6 and 10 in the Fantasy Pros IDP scoring. And those guys were at number 6 was Bradley Chubb from Miami with 11.8. Josh Allen from Jacksonville also with 11.8. There was a tie there. Micah Parsons from Dallas. He comes in with 10.5 points per game. Myles Garrett from Cleveland, 10.3. And Trey Hendrickson from Cincinnati, also 10.3 points per game. All right, so now we'll look at those same metrics that we did with the top 5, and we'll see how this bottom half of the top 10 does. Like, so 6 through 10. In total snaps, the biggest difference that I can see in the group when we look at this number 6 through 10 is that there's not nearly as many snaps that they take as the top 5 does. Like Josh Allen had 880 total snaps, and he was leading this group from number 6 through 10 in total snaps, but it's about 200 snaps behind the bottom of the top 5 scorers. And Hendrickson, he was third with 742, but he is over 300 snaps behind Max Crosby, who is in that 5th spot, on the total points per game. So we're seeing that, okay, total snaps, like if you're on the field a lot more, you have a lot more opportunity and you're going to have a higher points per game. We go to the pass rush snaps. I mean, it's interesting to see like all 5 of these guys, number 6 through 10. And again, 6 through 10 is going to be Chubb, Allen, Parsons, Garrett, and Hendrickson. All of those guys right now are clumped. They're together. Unfortunately, they're just not at the top. Instead of being at the top, they're all finished 9th through 10th respectively. So, excuse me. So that right there shows that, okay, pass rush snaps means a lot. It's further indication of what we found with the top 5, that we want these guys who are actually rushing the passer along with being on the field.
So I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Just to take away everything so far, which is blowing my mind that for so long in IDP circles, we would take things like pressure rate and win rate and any other pass rushing metric and use that to define the upside and fantasy value for an edge rusher or a defensive lineman. And here you are reminding all of us, like, hey, they do other things besides that. They do other things besides rush the passer. You have to think about, like you were talking about with some of these edge rushers, like setting the edge, getting some tackles, whether it's stopping the run. There are tackles and coverage. Like there's so many different roles that these defensive linemen play than being a true edge rusher. So if you don't get, let's say it's draft season, it's startup season for Dynasty, or it's we get to redraft season and we're looking at these players. From what I'm understanding and from what the listeners are understanding, you're saying it's probably better to go with the high volume snapped player first, just because they cross off all the different metrics and production ultimately. And then when you get outside of the realm where like you're not getting those players, you have the people who are playing fewer snaps. That's where efficiency starts playing more of a role. Is that fair to say? Did I summarize that properly, or did I butcher everything you just said?
No, you summarized that absolutely perfectly, because that's exactly what these numbers are showing me. Like at this point, and I agree with you. Like IDP scoring, like I'm relatively new to it, but it is different now because I'm thinking the NFL game has changed. So these edge rushers, who are out there, not only are they getting after the quarterback, but because of the new Shanahan way of playing football, where there's so much movement, there's so much spreading out, and they're going east and west, and so they have to do a lot more. So if they're trying to get after the quarterback, they get rid of the ball quickly. They dump it off on a screen or some type of bubble or whatever sweep. Now that guy is drifting out, to the numbers. He's trying to set the edge to make sure they don't get outside of him, and he can come down and actually make a tackle. So they're doing a lot more than just rushing the passer. You look at a specialist like Micah Parsons. Micah Parsons, now he lines up everywhere. I'm surprised that we haven't seen him line up out wide at corner yet, but he's actually doing everything, because they're trying to get away from him, so it really is showing like a lot difference that if you look at the guys who are getting that volume, who are actually good at that position, like you look at Max Crosby, high motor, never stops. TJ Watt, a flat out stud. He never stops. So these guys are not only on the field on third down or long situations, they're actually out there and they're making plays on those short downs too. So first and second downs, like second and short, Max Crosby is coming in to make a defensive tackle. Crosby is running across the field to get like a 5-yard tackle somewhere. So these guys, they're doing way more than just pinning their ears back and just rushing the quarterback. So like exactly what you're saying, like it is changed a little bit. And it does seem that those guys that get a lot of that volume are getting more opportunity to do those other things besides get sacks.
Man. So let's take this a step further. So again, you're getting into, the thralls of Dynasty season, and we're doing startups, and people are doing, whether they're in all IDP Dynasty leagues or they're doing mixed offense and IDP, and they get to the point where it's like, I should address the IDP position. I should address, these players. We talk about defensive ends. We talk about outside linebackers. We talk about, like you mentioned, TJ Watt and Micah Parsons, how they basically control the edge. Although, like you said, Micah Parsons is lining up everywhere. Are you of the belief that it's better to draft players that play more of that linebacker role still versus being a pure pass rusher defensive end in terms of upside for fantasy, just because they are the ones who on short situations are trying to make that tackle to prevent a first down or get that tackle for a loss or so on and so forth? Or are you a believer that, no, I'm going to hold that hope and hope I hit the nail on the head for the elite defensive end whose primary job is just rushing the passer?
No, so as for me, like my mindset is to going after the guy who is going to give me a more consistent floor. So, with anything in fantasy, like nothing's guaranteed, but there are things that have a higher probability of happening. So I believe that TJ Watt has a higher probability of getting a couple tackles, getting a couple pressures, and disrupting a game more so than TJ Watt getting in the backfield and getting two sacks, on the quarterback. It could still happen, but it might not. So TJ Watt, I know that he's going to drop in cover sometimes. So he may give me a fluky interception that's going to offset, like somebody who's might get more sacks because they just rush the quarterback a lot more. I want the volume because I just want as much opportunity as I can get, because the more chances you get to get fantasy points, the more likely you will get fantasy points. You know what I mean? So you look like Parsons, like I keep going. I feel like I'm picking on Parsons a lot, but if you keep looking at Parsons and you're looking at Bosa, when you know what their prime directive is, like they are going after the quarterback. Well, teams know this as well as you and I do, so when they're like seeing that, all right, they're going to try to do things to disrupt you. I've seen there's been a huge shift of, on down distance, and you're lining up and you see when Bosa, which is pretty impressive how he gets in his stance, like he does like that yoga stretch, and that this guy is ready to unleash the beast. You just run right at him because he is hell bent on getting to the quarterback. Like if you just knock him off his, his angle a little bit, and then you can just move on. That's what we start to see where Bosa was not as effective this year as he normally has been. And then you look in the middle of the season when, they were like, we're going to stop letting Micah Parsons destroy us. Now granted, the refs didn't want to give him any holding calls.
Bringing in the controversy. Okay, yeah, exactly.
But, so there's things like that. So you look at it all comes together. But like, just like on the offensive side of ball, if you're playing PPR, like you want the PPR gold. Like I don't need somebody like Will Fuller back in the day who's going to give me one pass for 57 yards and a touchdown. Give me Jarvis Landry, who's going to give me 10 catches for 50 yards. You know what I mean? Because he is going to outscore that big play. big plays. It's the NFL. And we all know the NFL, like all these guys are really good. Like we're watching it and we might say, oh, this guy's not so good just because they're compared to the other top 1% of football players in the world. You know what I mean? So all these guys are really good. So that means these big plays aren't going to happen as often as we want them to, or as often as it happens when we're playing Madden. So give me just the consistent little things that's going to stack up to be a lot more than just a major play, every 2 or 3 games.
No, that makes sense. You mentioned earlier Aiden Hutchinson, and I'm probably jumping the gun here, but as a lot of the football viewing audience out there was, unless you were a hardcore 49er fan, like you were cheering for the Lions to get to the Super Bowl, right? And I'm curious to hear what is your thoughts on, or what information you found in regards to Aiden Hutchinson and what kind of dropped him out of the top performers here for fantasy purposes.
Okay. Yeah. So as you see, Aiden Hutchinson, like he finished number 12, for edge rushers in 2023 for the points per game scoring. And like you're wondering why, because when you watch him play on Sundays, like he's high motor guy, he's out there, he's doing a whole lot of things. You see him all the time. You see him rushing the passer. You just see him doing a lot of stuff. But it did not translate into fantasy points per game. He only had 10 points per game. So if we go and we look at those metrics and everything. So remember, we talked about total snaps, saying that you wanted to be over 900 total snaps, to give a good indication of fantasy points. Well, Aiden Hutchinson was third in total snaps with 986. In pass rush snaps, Aiden Hutchinson was up there also. He was number 2 in pass rush snaps behind Max Crosby with 624. So he's over that, 530 mark that you're looking for. In total pressures, Aiden Hutchinson was doing his thing. He was second in total pressures, only behind Michael Parsons with 101. And even if you look at the tackles, like Aiden Hutchinson's job is not to go out there and make a whole lot of tackles, but he finished like 15th in the top 20 when it comes to that. So you're looking at that. So you're sitting there thinking, like, all right, so the total snaps, the pass rush snaps, and the defensive stops. I'll tell you what he did in stops. Aiden Hutchinson. So his stops number was a little low. So he wasn't topping that. He was actually 18th when it comes to defensive stops. So now we're starting to see where it is. So even though he's high in the total snaps, he's high in the pass rush, massive drop when it comes to defensive stops. All right. That's not necessarily what else is hitting her in him. Like, so once I saw that, I was like, but still, like he's on the field so much, he's doing so much. Well, like, what else am I missing here? His win rate is 21.3. So that's good. His tackle rate, is not too bad either. And like his pressure rate was 16.2. So you're like, how can he be doing all these things, dominating so much in the field, but his points per game was so low. And then I went and I wanted to, all right, so what is his missed tackle rate? And then when I saw his missed tackle rate, I saw that it is 24%.
Well,
and that explained everything. When I see that he is missing like so many tackles, that is why he is not scoring those additional points, like for the tackles that he's getting. And I was looking at his pass rushing. So his pressure is up there and his pass rushing is up there. What I'm thinking has happened so much this season is that Aiden Hutchinson is going hard to get sacks. He had 11 sacks in the season, so he's doing his thing in that regards. But I'm thinking that he may be over pursuing a little bit, which is leading to him missing, and that's why he dropped a lot. So that's where Hutchinson ends up.
That's crazy. That's crazy because he had such an effective and efficient rookie year, and just see the drop just like double in terms of missed tackle rate and or missed tackle efficiency, however you want to call it. That is telling. So then here's the question. You know this, I know this. The people who are listening and watching, they know this now. Here's the kicker. You're probably not going to get him at a discount.
Highly doubt it.
Or your redraft, just because name, play on the field is going to supersede fantasy output. But if you're the shrewd fantasy manager, IDP manager, in a dynasty, it's tough, man. It's tough. It's tough. Like, where do you value Aiden Hutchinson going forward? To find that out, you should head over to fantasyandframes.com and check out our dynasty rankings. And as we get ready for draft season, our draft rankings, and of course, our weekly rankings. Dude, Chris, this is so much knowledge. This is crazy. This is crazy. Again, I go back to what you were saying, and we said earlier. So many people like talking about the key metrics, the win rate, the pressure rates, the efficiency, and they just blindly neglect to talk about, how much are they on the field? And here's the thing. A lot of people out there in fantasy football land, let's face it, a lot of them don't play IDP fantasy football. It's for people who enjoy football and people who I like the most. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. To all you who are listening and watching. I think IDP fantasy football gives people more of an appreciation for offense, really, because now what these offensive players are having to go through to get to the production that they get on a weekend and weekend basis. And I think we're going to do a really good job, and you did a really good job today, Chris. And I think this show is going to do a really good job this year, more so than in other years, of really trying to bring it back home to, like, not only are we going to bring it back home to where the fantasy production meets the on-field play, but how fantasy production for IDP can kind of mirror offense and bring that correlation together so that you can feel comfortable playing IDP and enjoy it and be able to not be scared of saying, well, I don't understand why my offensive wide receiver or running back is playing so poorly. Well, it's like, well, he's taking on a fairly efficient player who's playing a lot of snaps. Like, put that will help bridge that gap, while you're shooting the gap. Wow, it's too late. It is way too late for me to be making jokes like that. Anyhow, I'm sorry. But what I shall say to people out there is look out for a lot of our prospect content coming out soon for the NFL draft. Look out for our dynasty target content. We have a lot of things lined up for you here on Shoot the Gap. And I'm really excited that Chris, you're a part of Shoot the Gap now. I think everybody else here is going to be super excited that's listening to the content, because you just dropped so much knowledge here on people that it is unreal. And so thank you very much for agreeing to come on Shoot the Gap and be with us going forward. And any last words before we wrap up tonight?
No, like, I'm excited. I appreciate, the opportunity to come on, like, Shoot the Gap, talk about some IDP, because I agree with you. It is making, the offensive side of football a lot more exciting. So I'm glad to be here and look forward to rocking with you guys.
All right, folks. So this was our makeup episode from last week. This Wednesday at 10 p.m., our usual time here, we will be talking about the 2023 linebackers, top performers, top 20, and giving you our thoughts on their performance, the behind-the-scenes look at what made them special in terms of their performance, as well as whether we think they're people that you could be counting on in 2024 and beyond. So for Chris, I'm Jorge. Thank you very much for tuning in to Shoot the Gap. Don't forget to rate, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. You can now listen to Shoot the Gap exclusively when you go into Spotify or Apple or iTunes and just look for the Shoot the Gap podcast, and let us know what you think, and we'll see you on Wednesday.